Is this working?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this conversation about transitioning. No. Let me see if I can. Is this any better? All right. Thank you for joining us for this conversation about transitioning to a global plant-based future. I think there's no question that there's been an increased interest in plant-based foods recently. A lot of fast food companies have added plant-based proteins to their menu. We're seeing retail sales go up. A lot of big food companies, Kellogg, Nestle, Tyson, Smithfield, Kroger, and others are entering the space. I think the questions we do have are around what's driving the trend, where it's going, and the potential downsides to this growing trend, if there are any. So I'd like to kick it over to Jeanette to talk from Upfield about the policy paper. Oh, and a note for you all, if you want to speak, click the button. If you want to turn your mic off, click it again.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Danielle. Can everyone hear me okay? Yes. Okay, great. My booming Australian accent. Thank you, Danielle, for joining us and also introducing the topic that we have today. And on behalf of Concordia and myself, thank you so much for the panellists who are joining us for this strategic dialogue. I know you're all very busy and we really do appreciate your time. I'm here on behalf of Upfield, who is the largest plant-based food company in the world, and we have brands that hopefully some of you are familiar with, such as Country Crock, Flora, Basal, Rama, I can't believe it's not butter, as well as Blue Band. As a new company, we actually came into being in July of 2018, and we had the great opportunity, which you often don't get to do, to start from scratch in a company of defining what a new purpose. And ours is around making people healthier and happier with great tasting, natural, plant-based foods that are good for our consumers, good for us, and also good for the planet. And that really leads everything that we do as a company. Our strategy and everything that we've done has been set around that. And that has really led us to this strategic dialogue today with all of you. We firmly believe in when we eat more plants in our diet, we'll not only live a healthier life, but will also contribute to a more environmentally sustainable world. Of course, to eat more plants is not simple. I have a background in dietetics and nutrition, and I can tell you to get sometimes your patients to eat more plants is quite difficult. So it's by no means an easy task. We do believe that economic sustainability requires that food systems shift towards plant-based foods while ensuring just transition and also economic enabling of all farmers and workers to be involved in food systems of the future. At the same time, within a primarily plant-based food system, we need to ensure we promote responsible sourcing, shorter supply chains, locally sourced ingredients, responsible water stewardship, net zero emissions, and the protection of biodiversity and soil. A world using sustainable agricultural practices leads to a minimising of our environmental footprint while facilitating a healthier lifestyle. Put simply, as one of our panellists in the EU and the UK said, put simply, a more sustainable diet is a healthier diet. A healthier diet is often a more sustainable diet. As a new organisation, we defined our purpose during the setup of the business, as I said before, meaning that all actions are guided by that. And some examples of what we've done so far in our short times of just being over 12 months old, we transformed our entire Flora range to be 100% plant-based in the UK. Here in the United States, we introduced Country Crock plant butter, both with natural, simple ingredients, also great tasting, which is very important, and a lower carbon footprint. We also continue to analyse the nutritional content of our products, and many of you might know our Proactive brand, which seeks to help consumers lower their cholesterol, if that's what they need to do, which is really important as one of the risk factors for heart disease. In 1 year, we've changed our purchasing to 100% sustainable palm oil, which we notified everyone of last week. We've also sustainably sourced 100% soy. The pulp and paper we use will be 100% FSC certified by the end of this year, and our packaging is 100% recyclable depending on where you are in the world. But we believe in avoidance is more important than recycling, and so we have a goal to go plastic free. Due to the passionate interest in a better plant-based future is why we've gathered a panel of experts to discuss sustainable, healthy food systems with the backdrop of a policy paper that we're launching today. This paper has gone through several rounds of expert consultation and feedback with valuable insights from a range of people, some of who are here with us today, Jessica and also Anna, who ran our 2 panels across the Atlantic from each other. And we also consulted with consumers. I've been working in policy for a long time, and sometimes as companies we don't ask consumers necessarily what they think about the policies. And we did that for this particular paper. And I think it was Jessica who said to me clearly, just say eat more plants, and I think consumers agree with you. One of our policy recommendations is that we need to bring together a multidisciplinary group of experts across public, private and non-profit sectors informed by academic research. I'm thrilled to be joined by such a group here today to discuss deliberate next steps for a better food system. With that, Danielle, I'll hand back over to you to help facilitate the conversation.
Thank you. I guess I'll just start with a general question for everyone. Do you see what's happening now as a revolution, a sea change in the way we eat, or is this just a fad?
I'll answer that question. I saw this as a way to go 7 years ago, and I think it's happening. It's not a fad. It's not a fad. It is here to stay. But the main thing is, one of the things you just said, it has to taste good. If it doesn't taste good, people are not going to eat it. It's not people. That's the number one. I know health matters and all those other things are important factors, but tasting right is what you need to do first.
I would agree. I think it's 40 years in the making, and I think it's not going to go anywhere, and I think it is here to stay. And I think a lot of people are now finding themselves confused about diets and confused about what to eat and confused about messages on climate. And I think the more that we can, in the value chain, kind of begin to help people understand how to get there, how to prepare food in their kitchens, how to prepare food in their restaurants, how to kind of give back and look at it, I think that we're only going to see it accelerate, not decrease.
Go ahead. I'll go after you. Okay, thanks. Well, thank you for having this. It's really important. I think it's an evolution. I don't think we're going to go from 1 to 100 overnight. First place, I've been involved in agriculture and food production issues for a very long time, and almost half the proceeds of agriculture in the world are livestock-based. So it's like, and that's in the U.S. and that's globally as well. So we're probably not going to, tomorrow afternoon, go to a 100% plant-based diet. But the opportunities for a much more diversified diet for health and for environmental reasons are very, very pressing. Use of water, climate change, the role of climate change, and health. I do think that what we probably need as much as anything is a dedicated, enhanced research budget, along what you're talking about, to go into figuring out what the human body needs in terms of its nutrients, how a plant-based diet can help in that regard, and how we deal with the issue of taste and consumer affairs as appropriate. This is not going to be a totally non-controversial subject, given the nature of agriculture in the world today. But what you're finding is more and more people in production agriculture are understanding the need for plant-based diet. The major meat companies are now getting into this field. The major restaurant companies are getting into this field. So it's something that's going to happen. It's not just a fad.
I would tend to agree with Mr. Glickman that it's something that is happening, but it's also something that is gradual. That being said, I think that there is a tremendous sense of urgency. We need to transform our food systems as quickly as we possibly can. I mean, the tremendous amount of impact that we are having on our terrestrial systems, the tremendous impact of climate change. These are crises. These are very real crises. And the way we have produced, consumed, wasted our food has been, by and large, the greatest contributor to this crisis. One of the things that we do need to keep in mind is that right now, four of the crops that we largely use in agriculture today are producing 75% of the global food supply. At the same time, there's a tremendous potential for neglected and underutilized species that can be used to have environmental benefits, to have benefits for biodiversity conservation, to have health benefits as well. And I think that these are some of the opportunities that we really need to capitalize upon, and we need to do it very quickly. So obviously, the shift and transition to plant-based diets is definitely one step in that direction. But it's not just about producing more plants, it's about how we produce them, who we are obtaining them from, and ensuring sustainability throughout the whole of the food supply chain.
Yeah, I think the trends also depend on where you are and who you are. I think while we see beef has been coming down in the United States, we see an uptick in veganism in the UK. There's other regions, other countries, other individuals who are increasing their meat consumption, increasing processed packaged foods. I think a lot of it has to do with socioeconomic status, access, cost, desirability, lifestyle. There's been some really interesting work out of IFPRI, Derek Heddy and Harold Alderman, showing the cost of animal source foods is just not accessible for some people in the world. Where you go to Baltimore and hamburger is really cheap. So I think we can't blankly say that plant-based foods, the trend is on the rise. I think it really depends on where you are, the equity in the food system, access issues. So I think there's very different trends depending on where you're coming from.
Can I just jump in on that? Because I think the risk we run of this, I think it is largely out of the box, the idea of healthier food, plant-based food, but there's going to be a backlash if we don't do the kinds of things Jessica says, if we don't think about where in the world we're talking about. And a lot of the meetings I go to, there's people from all different parts of the world, and they only think about their own part of the world. So I work, GAIN works a lot in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, and in those contexts, kids don't get, 80% of kids don't get a minimum acceptable diet, 80%. And so when you put that side by side with recommendations that people in Africa and Asia should be eating less meat and less animal source foods, that's very tough for any policymaker or any family to reconcile. So I tweet a lot as well, and often I'll catch myself tweeting something about, we should be eating less meat. Then I'll get a plethora of tweets from Africa saying, you guys, you've been eating meat for decades and decades. It's our turn to eat some meat. So I think these narratives, we have to be very super careful, and it reminds me a lot of the climate debate. Who are the major emitters per capita, and the ones that are emitting the most have the biggest responsibility to change the most.
Can I add something to this? I think it's a process, as it was said. It's a process that is starting, but we cannot have one solution for everywhere, as Lawrence was mentioning before. There are several things that we need to take into account. First, given that this is a process that is starting, we need to be sure that it's inclusive, because it's based on technology. And this could end in a very problematic situation that will only benefit certain regions of the world and not everybody. So it has to be inclusive, and we need to find ways in which this technology can be accessible. The second element, which is extremely important, is information, because not all the solutions could be safe. We need to be careful, and we need to share information across the board so that especially the countries that have less resources can have access to it. And the last is that there is a huge opportunity. This issue that eating a piece of meat in Africa, as Jessica was mentioning, relative to the US, that there is kind of a 3 times the price, brings a huge opportunity for technology to innovate and to do things. And we need to find a way to resolve the problem, because the problem is not necessarily a generic problem. It has a lot of heterogeneity across regions. And if we don't take that into account and we come with a blunt idea that everything needs to be non-meat based, it could create significant problems that we won't be able to resolve, which today we are facing enormous problems.
So maybe adding to the point that you were raising earlier in terms of consumer input, in terms of consumer input being important, like I think we can often form ourselves into echo chambers of like-minded people who are conscious, et cetera, et cetera. There are differences in different parts of the world. There are also huge differences in where we are as a city or in the country that we're in. Consumer behavior is fundamentally a lot stickier than we all like to acknowledge. Half of hotel reservations are still made by calling the hotel when there's lots of online options. There's been artificial sweeteners around for a really long time, but sugar drinks outpace that 2 to 1 most of the time. Consumer behavior is sticky, and underneath that are not just sort of there's taste, which is really important. There's also what moments or what reasons people are eating meat. If it's an opportunity for people to celebrate with family or to, show their socioeconomic status in a particular part of the world, people make very different decisions. And so as we talk about research, understanding consumers and how they decide and how they behave is going to be really critical as we figure out where this is going to evolve.
So just to put in some context, I think this issue of the distribution of animal products, I mean, the reason wealthier people have to eat less animal product is precisely because so few people in the world eat significant amounts of animal products. So we put out a report, Creating a Sustainable Food Future, with the World Bank, World Resource Institute this summer, and we modeled this. And we project a 70% increase in demand for animal products by 2050. But even in 2050, 60% of the world, 6 billion people, eat a half of the US consumption of animal products or less. And only 20% of the world eat significant amounts of beef, which are the gigantic sources of emissions. So the reason the wealthy have to eat less is precisely to create some space for the poor to eat more. And the biggest environmental effect, really, which doesn't get focused on, is land. And basically all climate strategies require that we not only stop deforesting land, but most require that we reforest large areas of pasture land. But we project a 90%, an 88% increase in the demand for ruminant meat. So that means you have to have this, particularly a reduction in this consumption. Now, my view is I actually had an op-ed in CNN this year where I do think this was a historic change. And I think that the issue is product quality and price, and people do respond to that. So the average American, the average European, eat a third less beef than he or she did in the 1960s. And that was largely due to the rise of chicken getting cheaper and becoming more suitable in terms of breast meat. So I actually think, and I think this year was the change. And I think that the key is going to be, right now they're tiny, right? The consumption of animal-based products is still tiny. But we now, for the first time, have real substitutes that really taste the same. And when they get cheaper, when they're markedly cheaper than conventional animal products, I think there is the potential for a massive change. And the job will be, among other things, helping that happen quickly in the developing world, where it actually should be a cheaper form of protein.
Only one comment on that, because we need to be careful. Supply and demand is not static, okay? So if I reduce the demand, that doesn't mean that my supply won't respond. And it will respond very quickly, 9 months to be exact. That's the rotation you need. And that will imply that the price won't go down. So don't assume that because you reduce the demand, the price in Africa will be lower. So the problem is different. It's a little bit more complicated.
Talking about the price of plant-based alternatives, that's the key. It's when they're actually cheaper. So right now they're still a little bit higher, at least the premium products are a little bit higher. And when they're actually But they should be a lot cheaper because they require a lot fewer resources. And when that happens, that's when the big change will happen.
In here for a second, I don't want to derail the conversation, but one thing I do want to bring up is that the trend that we're seeing is of consumers who do tend to be sticky adding these items to their order, or adding these items to their grocery basket in addition to meat. So I just want us to keep that in mind, and I'm curious how you take that into account, that there is this movement towards plant-based meats, but it seems to be as a complement or as a test or as a trial. And I'm curious if that type of adoption is enough to drive the change that we're talking about in terms of the environment, in terms of pricing, in terms of this type of shift. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Well, certainly Cargill and Tyson, who are the largest beef and chicken companies, perhaps in the world, but certainly in the United States, are taking that tact. They're looking to augment plant-based product as a test, an experiment, to see if customers will in fact modify their diets to some way to give them more choices and be a competitive factor. Now, whether it's to drive out their underlying products, I doubt that very much. But I think it is significant to see the major producers of protein in this world beginning to move into this area. I just want to mention one other point. Plant and animal products are so interrelated, inextricably related. Most of the corn that's grown in this country is grown to feed animals. That corn is supplied with water and underground aquifers. Most of the soybeans that are grown in Brazil are growing to feed animals, chickens or whatever else it is. So, one of the things, it's an argument for becoming more diversified in terms of protein production. It's also an argument for more research, because we may find that we can actually grow animals using a lot less inputs of water and other non-sustainable ways to give consumers and the environment more choices as well. That's why I go back to this point, how research is so important in terms of nutrient quality and ways to make much more sustainable agriculture. So there is no one size fits all. There was this old slogan, for every complicated problem, there is a simple and a wrong solution. and it's probably true here, although people do want to see reduced use of water and pesticides and other additives, and people are really much more concerned about their health than they used to be.
Sorry, I haven't been quick enough to take the floor, so my compliments to the rest here. I was almost hitting it with my elbow.
You'll do badly at Jeopardy.
It's like Jeopardy.
Yeah, exactly. Right, okay. Maybe just to reinforce, you mentioned about consumers, and from our perspective, it's important to look at what types of consumers. And one of the fears that I have is we end up with sort of a north-south separate dialogue. For us, focusing on smallholder farmers, they are consumers of food. They normally face large amounts of malnutrition and undernutrition. So the solutions that we come up with, I think, are very important for looking at consumers in the north, but particularly those in the south as well.
I'll go first, and so that we at least all get. It's so difficult to jump in. I feel like I'm 5 points or 10 points behind, so maybe I'll emerge some of the points, but I'll try and be quick. From the developing world perspective, I think one of the reasons it's not a fad, the reason I think it's going to hold is because we've found the sweet spot. And I noticed this when I was home this summer with my 19-year-old daughter. I'm focused on the nutrition. That's where the plant-based diet comes in. But my daughter's focused on the environment and the planet. And so finally we come to the table willing to try, experiment, put new things in the grocery basket that we're both interested, possibly for different reasons. But it's when those two worlds come together, and I actually am excited to try a new thing that my daughter wants to try, that's when the family's probably going to change behavioral patterns. And we've all talked about how difficult that can be to actually get the changes made. However, in my everyday world, as a nutrition director that serves most of the world's malnourished children, my main focus is how do we get those nutrients? And so many others have brought that up. And there's really nothing better, the evidence would suggest, then adding an egg once or twice a week, then adding that milk to really give small children and pregnant and lactating women those nutrients that they're going to need, they do need to survive and thrive. So again, the context argument that's already been discussed. I'll cut there.
Anna's allowed me to jump in ahead of her, just to reinforce. Well, she didn't have much choice, no, but just to reinforce the point about people in the West and the high-income countries talk about protein a lot, but the main reason to consume animal-sourced foods is for the micronutrients, is the vitamins and the minerals, and you just don't get that in the plant protein substitutes. Really key point. Also, it's not just consumers that are sticky. Policymakers don't like to change. Donors don't like to change, governments don't like to change, and actually a lot of companies don't like to change either. So we have to, when we think of behavior change, it's not just consumers.
Politicians don't like to change.
Them too, they're the worst.
I was just going to make the point, just as Danielle was asking about the role of alternative protein in the mix. And I would like to caution everyone about just the one, silver bullet or one solution. I think we need to think from the perspective of portfolio of proteins, from animal to plant-based. And I think one of the concerns that I have and we have is, I think it's great that you have these alternative proteins, animal proteins, that are gaining so much traction, but they don't necessarily address some of the health concerns. And so we need to be able to kind of, we are now in a world where we have to combine both the health and the planet concern together. And if we're just going down one track and thinking that, if we're only solving some of the sustainability issues, we might actually reinforce some of the health problems.
Just one last add to that. I mean, I think when we look at these protein alternatives and we look at kind of how things are heavily refined and heavily processed, I think that continues to create health problems. So I think in the balance of looking at these solutions and going back to when Jessica first had mentioned health, right, and around the table, I think that those are really important to consider as we're thinking how we move this forward.
Only a small comment. I think, and I completely agree with the idea of the portfolio and finding solutions across the space, but we need to understand that food and poverty, SDG 1 and SDG 2, are the ones we are most off path and off track today. So we need to look at this and look at the trade-offs of whatever interventions we're going to do. It's very important to look at the trade-offs, and normally we don't do that, and we come up with solutions which not necessarily are the best for all the potential situations.
I think that the bigger issue around sustainability and health are these very highly processed packaged foods. I mean, everywhere you go, it's fried foods. They're tasty, they're delicious, and we haven't even really done the life cycle assessments on these very processed packaged foods and the environmental footprint. We don't understand them. And, Jeanette, it's great that you guys are thinking about packaging and things like that. But, I think we've gotten a little bit sideline. The animal source foods is a huge one. Beef, its impacts on land use, deforestation is an issue, but people don't only eat animals, they eat lots of different foods that make up their dietary patterns, and more of that is these processed, packaged, cheap foods that we need to be thinking about. And how do we make those very convenient, low-price, tasty foods healthier? And those of you who work in food industry call it the jelly bean effect. Should we be fortifying junk food, or should we just be trying to move away from junk food? So to me, that it's a growing concern. Where we see some regions where there's a flattening of processed packaged foods, although a larger proportion of the diet. In other places like Latin America and Asia and Africa, we're seeing this really significant upswing. Not just in urban places, you're seeing these foods everywhere, in rural places, et cetera. So an interesting study just came out in Nepal, looking in Kathmandu, very poor country, where 25% of children ages 12 to 23 months were consuming junk food. That's not great, right? So that starts a trend that goes into adulthood and, of course, has significant health impacts around low fiber, low whole grains, low fruits and vegetables. So to me, I wish we would expand the diet conversation for health and climate to not just animals, but to all foods that people consume in their daily diet. So.
like to add something to this. I'm a meat scientist, so this is with a PhD in meat science, biochemistry, and nutrition. And I've been working in the food industry since '86, so I've been creating new food products for food companies. And now, about 6 years ago, at a meat science convention, they were talking about how do you feed the world 2050, 9.5 to 10 billion people. And I was thinking, that's a problem I'd like to try to solve. And I'm a person, that's what I've been doing for the last 33 years, is solving problems. So we started looking at, getting more efficient producing meat is just, you can get a little bit better, but you're never going to solve that problem with just that one source. So I'm in the camp of all of the above. So I said, well, we could probably do it with plants if you could do that. And my particular thing was protein. I know there's a lot of micronutrients and things like that, but I was looking at simply can we take plant protein, turn it into something that people will eat. You're talking about eating junk food. I don't like to use the word junk food, but there's food that tastes good that doesn't have the nutritional qualities that you would like to have. Food is food. It does provide some type of nourishment, but you want to eat things that you like to eat because it's a social thing too, as well as economics. There's all sorts of things about that. So Improved Nature, what we're doing here, and we are a commercial company, we're producing today, is taking plant protein, turning it into fibers that have the taste, the look, and the nutritional quality of meat with just one ingredient, no other ingredients. And we're doing this.
What's the ingredient?
Well, right now we're just at soy protein because it's a balanced amino acid profile and it's a one-to-one replacement. That was the way we were going to to really be a profitable company. But our technology is not germane to just soy protein. We can take multiple plant proteins. We're just realigning plant proteins into the texture, the taste, and the look of meat. And we're doing it with just steam, pressure, and heat. That's it. And so of all the complicated productions that I've done through the years, this production plant is pretty simple. We have one ingredient coming in and one ingredient going out, and all we're doing is changing the form. And then we can produce, from that, we can produce things like something that looks like a chicken breast or a tender or something that's like a strip of protein. And nuggets, fillets, shreds, or even jerky. In fact, we've already launched nationally our jerky, which has only 7 ingredients in it, and all of them you recognize. There's nothing completely amazing about that. So to me, I looked at that and said, okay, now all of a sudden we can take a quality protein and feed 9.5, 10 billion people something that they want to eat that has a balanced amino acid profile, and somebody can correct me here, but I don't know of a protein source that's more economical than soy protein is providing a balanced amino acid. You can produce like 347 pounds per acre versus trying to raise the same quality protein of beef as just 30 or below. So we're like 20 times more sustainable, and it tastes good. Now, I've just told you I'm a meat guy, and I eat our product. In fact, it's actually, in certain instances, it actually tastes better than the meat it's actually replacing.
You're 120 years old and you look.
Yeah, yeah, I'm 15. Yeah.
I'll jump. I think it's an interesting question of whether the current trend that we're seeing with plant-based as meat substitutes is perhaps the healthiest. Is it the best way to get people in? I think one argument is that it tastes good. I'm comfortable with it. I love burgers. I'm just gonna give the plant-based trend a try, and then perhaps people might from there transition into a more a general plant-based diet that includes vegetables and whole grains and other sources of protein. So my question here, in addition to the conversation we're already having, is that do you believe that's a good argument, that this current iteration of plants as alternatives to animal products is a good way into a more heavily vegetarian diet, or is it perhaps steering us away from a different path that could be just as easy, just as impactful on the environment, but also perhaps healthier?
I mean, I think the Impossible Burger, Beyond Burger is a great experiment on getting something that looks, tastes, bleeds, smells like meat. So it's not such a huge shift in going from burgers to broccoli. So I think it's an easier entry point for people who really love meat. And I agree with you, Danielle. I think in the U.S., in D.C., we have Impossible Burger everywhere. It's at the same cost, if not higher, than an all-beef burger. But I think people are in the experiment mode right now. They're trying it. It was pretty good. I had cheese and mayonnaise and fried onions on it, and it was delicious. It's sort of that kind of a thing right now, and people are in the experimentation phase. But I think it's one of those easier nudges than, say, moving to just vegetable stir fry 7 days a week. I just was in D.C. and they have PETA has all these vegan guides. And when you open the guide, maybe someone from PETA's in the room, I might insult them, but you open it, and a lot of it is really unhealthy vegetarian food, fried foods. So I think we're still in a phase where how do we get vegetarian cuisine at a cost that people want that's still convenient, and it becomes a shift towards a bigger part of their diet, as opposed to more of this experimentation phase of just slight nudges.
So I'm kind of in the all of the above category. People have to appreciate the magnitude of the challenge. I mean, 70% more animal products, even though 60% of the population will still eat few. So if they eat more, you're talking 2-3 times the animal products. So we have to do everything. And you start off with the fact that, I don't know, something like half of all animal products are eaten in a highly processed and minced form already. So we don't have to replace steak. We don't have to replace a delicious pork loin. You just have to start by replacing the relatively easy to replace stuff. We also have to remember that the vast majority of food is consumed in developing countries. So we're, here we talk, and commercially the business opportunities are here, and that was great because the fact that we have vegans, vegetarians created the market opportunity for companies to start inventing these beneficial products. But it don't mean much until it actually transfers, and that's really where we get into the price and easeability and ease. And I was talking with Pat Brown, and he was convinced that they could actually ship their form so that it can be mixed and made locally in very small operations in developing world conditions. So that's another factor that will be important to this. Just the last thing I would say is that from the nutrition side, I also think it's important to focus on the big picture things. So the nutrition side, the overwhelming issue in nutrition is too much sugar and too much, it's obesity triggered by too easily digestible carbohydrates and too much sugar. So those are issues that can be addressed also when making these alternative products. I mean, we're talking about overconsumption. I think it's really important, focus on the really critical things. Don't get too carried away with the.
Can I just add to his point, if I might? I do think that the Medicare program in the United States alone spends $180 billion a year treating diabetes, type 2 diabetes. And that's largely a sugar carbohydrate issue. It's fats too and other things, and I'm not a nutritionist. But that is and this issue may dovetail into that to some degree with a much more balanced diet. And it's complicated by the marketing of foods in America. We don't market blueberries very much because they're not high-calorie, dense, expensive foods. We market high-calorie stuff. What do kids watch on TV? They don't. This is the kind of stuff that they're encouraged to buy. But the type 2 diabetes and other foodborne illnesses are largely a sugar carbohydrate issue. Not entirely, but largely. The other thing is water. When you look at the critical environmental issue of our time, it's we spend 70% of the water that we use in the world is to irrigate crops. 70%. 30% is for everything else, including what we're drinking right here. Okay, so this, of course, relates to the fact that most of the crops that are produced go into feeding animals. Now, modern farm policy is encouraging farmers to produce new and alternative things, and that's a positive. So a farmer can now produce peaches or pears on his or her land that used to be required to produce soybeans, corn, and wheat on that land. It's a good thing, giving agriculturalists some flexibility in the process. I only raise these 2 points because, as you pointed out, I think the food issue is so complicated that there is just no one simple solution to it. But we do know that rapidly increasing disease and lack of water are 2 of the issues that are going to drive our policy agendas in the future. And to the extent that plant-based foods can dovetail into that, I think it can be a positive contributor.
Sorry, but maybe just one quick point. What I find interesting is that we have the opportunity of looking back in human history about how we've managed diets and tried to keep control of the nexus with our environment. We have about 370 million indigenous peoples who control about 80% of the world's biodiversity. Through their cultures, they've been able to survive, mitigate disease based on traditional grains, pulses, etc., mixed in with different types of protein sources. But unfortunately, a lot of this culture is undervalued, it's understudied and underappreciated. So perhaps looking backwards in order to look forward is an option.
Can I just jump in quickly? I got 3 very quick points. First point, food systems are wrecking our health system. Food systems are wrecking our environmental systems. A lot of the health and environment folks don't get that yet, still, and especially in places like Africa and Asia. So I completely agree with your point. Second point is, in the UK, there was just an evaluation of the sugar tax. The sugar tax has worked really well in terms of the sugar content of sugary drinks in the UK has gone down by about a third, 30%. The overall consumption of sugar, however, has kept going up in the UK. So it totally reinforces this point about you need a whole of government, whole of industry approach. But that's really difficult, right? If you're a policymaker, you're thinking, I can do 100 or 150 things, where do I start? So we need to do a better job of helping policymakers zero in on the weak point in their nutrition, in their food systems. Jess and I are working on a food system dashboard that's trying to do that. Final point, we're a bit too complacent about the sweet spot. I do agree with you. There is a sweet spot when it comes to climate and health, but not every vegetable is equal when it comes to how much energy, how much water, how much nutrients are required. So we need a lot more research on those kinds of trade-offs.
Sorry, I just want to jump in really quickly. I want to thank, actually, Mr. Hartman for bringing up the importance of nutrition in indigenous diets. And so, you know, traditional food cultures are largely being eroded. It's not just a question of, well, yes, they are absolutely, they have historically been much healthier, as Mr. Hartman has rightfully stated, but they are also being eroded by the current food system. So in many, for example, in many small island developing states, we're talking about states that are largely very reliant on imported foods. And these imported foods are almost across the board unhealthy. So it does draw upon Jessica Fanzo's point on the processed foods that we're exporting to these countries. So these links really are quite complex, as everybody has noted to this point. But in some cases, I think we really need to be looking back, going back to basics. So there are a lot of traditional crops that are very high in nutritional value that have gotten lost somewhere along the way and that need to be considered in these food options. We can't be focusing all our attention on the 5 primary crops, whether they be plant-based or not. So that does bring back the point, there is enormous potential for neglected and underutilized species, which is what I think Mr. Haddad was alluding to as well. So these are things that we really need to consider and in this discussion. I'll leave it there for now and jump in.
I think the question of, someone said not all vegetables are the same, and the question of monocrops and diversity in agriculture. I'm wondering that type of shift that I think would be environmentally, sustainably beneficial, where does that leave farmers today, dairy farmers, meat farmers, people who are supplying the type of food that we eat today? If we do shift away to a different type of farming in this country and elsewhere, what happens to them, and is there space for them in this transformation?
I think it's worthwhile to point out that agriculture is in a very difficult situation right now globally. Commodity prices are extremely weak, and currency and trade policy has made lives very difficult for American farmers and for European farmers and perhaps others as well. So you're not going to just snap your fingers and say to farmer X, get rid of your cows, we're going to start planting tomatoes. First place, you have climate issues, and you have infrastructure issues and financing issues and those kinds of things. My perception is younger farmers, newer farmers, better educated farmers understand that they have to, like any business people, have to become more entrepreneurial in what they're doing. And I think that's beginning to happen. If you look at the demographics of agriculture, newer and younger farmers are much more flexible in what they plant and how they operate their farms than older farmers. Unfortunately, the average age of the farmer in this country is in their mid-60s because a lot of people haven't found agriculture to be an extremely productive and economic enterprise. But this isn't just, we're not going to just tell farmers to change. We have to help them through the process and realize, as I said before, this is an evolutionary rather than a revolutionary process.
Only to add, I think it's really important that we understand that agriculture is one of the most distorted sectors in the world. So all the incentives are not aligned properly. We are subsidizing things that we are saying people are not supposed to eat. And that's coming mostly from developed countries. So unless we take a role on that, I don't think we are going to move forward. The second element, which is important, is information. This is a supply-demand issue. It's not just a supply issue. And when I was referring as inclusive, that's when we are worried about sectors that could be really affected by huge innovations, which could be good, but we need to find a way to put institutionality in place to minimize potential exclusion. But again, let's think carefully. Most of the subsidies are going to staples. Why we don't start resolving the source of the problem, reducing the asymmetries of information on consumers so that they demand what is better for their health, rather than imposing or pushing things which are not necessarily 100% based on science.
Tim, sure. Well, I think there's a spectrum of approach in terms of production systems, right? I think the conversation about having just large-scale industrial monocropping or a small-scale indigenous production system. And I think there's everything in the middle that we should consider, right? With diversity of crops, diversity of production methods, and in also like intercropping, that you allow forest, cattle, agricultural systems. And I think that's the model that we need to kind of think about and transition into. So your question about like farmers, they have to be part of this transition process. And I think obviously what drives them towards is the policy, right? Subsidies, or what kind of policy that is driving farmers today to produce in a specific way and specific crops, and then how do you sort of change those incentive systems to move to a more diverse and even more resilient production model?
Yeah.
Could I just, sorry, I just want to let people. we are going to take questions because I can see some people holding their arms up and I'm worried about their arms. So we're going to come to you shortly, okay?
I was just saying briefly that in the future, existing livestock farmers will probably still be producing livestock products even if we make major dietary changes. So in our scenarios where we project that basically the world's wealthy or large beef consumers reduce their beef consumption by 50%, we still have 40% more beef consumption, production and consumption in the world by 2050. So the world's efficient farmers need to still be producing food, the same thing. So we're jumping way, way ahead to this imaginary world. We need massive dietary change just to avoid having it go off the charts, right? I mean, we're still going to have livestock producers producing livestock products.
I just want to make a point here, because I hear about policy pushing things, and when I first went into the food industry, I thought I'm in R&D, so I get to create new food products, and I told them, no, marketing tells you what you're going to produce. And I'm going like, really? And so how does marketing know? Well, marketing talks to the consumer, and then you create a new food product. Well, I actually did something backwards. I actually created a product and then sold it to marketing, which was Lunchables. And I did that because I was a little naive, and I thought, well, maybe I can do something different. It became a pretty big success here in the U.S. But it is an emotional attachment to that food that creates the change in the consumer. And food, people have an emotional attachment to food. And you were talking about it's important and it drives all these other things. Yeah, after air and water, food is kind of like third on the list for survival. And it's also a social thing, and it's also an enjoyable thing, a part of life of eating good food. So to me, I've always thought it has to taste good first, then provide the nutrients, and then the sustainability can come into play. And I'll tell you what's happening in the plant-based food industry is that I'm talking with these groups, and I know all the vegan groups pretty well, our plant-based association and talking to them, they said, we realized if we were just going to try to tell you what you eat more, don't eat animals, eat more plants, it wasn't making much of a difference. So if we can provide something like the Beyond Meat Burger or the Impossible Burger or something that they call it like something you can eat now, and then maybe it can evolve into better, healthier diets, also better tasting food. That's the way to get there, and that's what we were doing. And one of the things I wanted to talk about earlier, you're saying, we need to ship this around the world and we need to have the price down. We're doing that today at Improved Nature. Our product is shelf stable. We're shipping overseas, unrefrigerated, and it can convert into quality protein products. So we can actually ship this anywhere in the world, and we turn our product into the finished product just by adding water, boiling water, just like you would do pasta or something like that. So and then it absorbs whatever flavor you want it to taste like. But it provides you with that enjoyment of eating a fibrous protein like meat. So we're trying, our thoughts were, number one, it has to taste good, number one, and also has to be sustainable, and the nutrition has to be there also. Now, I'm not trying to provide all the micronutrients. You need to be a part of a diet, but we're providing quality protein, calcium, fiber, potassium, and low sodium with no fat, no cholesterol, and it tastes good, and people will eat it. And the proof to our product is that we are actually selling products into the school lunch program, and the kids love it.
Just, if I may.
I have samples, and you're right. And I mean, this is a jerky. This is a big market, and people that eat beef jerky, and I know this because that was most of my training. They're very passionate about their jerky. Yeah. Okay. And I've given this to beef eaters, and they'll love it. So, and you're welcome to eat some of this.
Okay, Jonathan, and then we'll turn it to the.
Thank you. I just wanted to add to the narrative, or maybe just shift the narrative a little bit, is that when we talked about kind of taste and taste first and then nutrition, is that you almost have to start changing the conversation in developed countries about, that the good stuff actually tastes good. right? So that's an important element to bring in. And I also think that in order to change the narrative, before Great Performances, I ran a natural foods, plant-based culinary school. So I trained most of the chefs that are now part of the vegan revolution and otherwise. And the conversation that we were always having is about kind of what's on your plate. And I think if you think about climate and sustainability, and now you're thinking about nutrition and all these other elements that are coming into play, we have to actually just start talking about what's on your plate. And product people are going to hate this, sorry, but it's also about learning how to cook at home once again. And I think it's kind of what you are putting on your plates from home, right? So if you are in control of your ingredients, if you are in control of your traditions, if you are in control of your communities, that's when you can actually make a big personal impact in terms of what's happening in terms of the food system on climate, and then also on nutrition and otherwise. So I do think there was a point made earlier, and I'm sorry I don't remember who said it, but we are the eroding traditional food systems. I think it was you who made the point, but it's true. I mean, if you look at Indian culture, and now as a middle class emerged, and what is the mark of middle class? What's going to eat Domino's? Well, no, there's a loss of culture and a loss of healthful eating and a loss of things that are happening because we are forcing out in this country, we're pushing out popular culture. And popular culture is also the kind of diet that which we're consuming. So I do think if we can take all of this stuff, but start at home, buy some ingredients, learn how to cook, and be in control of it, you can actually make your own personal impacts.
Maybe I'm taking a step back a little bit. I think there is a lot to be gained, and a lot has been achieved by going grassroots up and people experimenting and being entrepreneurial, et cetera. At the end of the day, we're talking about a massive global system. And what's going to be, especially if we want to move at the pace that we want to move, we are talking about probably one of the largest peacetime transitions of a global economy that we've ever seen. And so this is begging for, if you look around this table, there's a whole lot of different voices of folks that are experimenting, folks that are designing policy, folks that are large private sector players, et cetera. And we have to have conversations about what are fundamentally new business models and fundamentally new ways in which public, private, and social sector is going to partner together. Because it's not going to be a natural evolution of let's keep experimenting and hope people will change their minds. We need innovative new ways to provide capital to private sector to experiment and do large-scale experiments in developing countries that fit consumers, bring those policymakers into the mix. There are some crazy policies around the world that people don't even realize that have been there for a long time about what is healthy and not, and about the size of blueberries that can be imported into China, and all kinds of things that all need to be worked through. So just to sort of step back to say we need to think about some substantive partnerships here.
Can I just very quickly jump in? Because I completely agree with that. It feels like a lot of the things we're talking about here is that's kind of straining against the existing system settings. So that the system is defined by a bunch of policy settings. For example, Maximo mentioned what we subsidize in terms of production, but it's also in terms of where the public R&D for agriculture goes. It goes mainly for the 4 or 5 big staples. It doesn't go to fruits and vegetables to improve their productivity. Public policy can play a huge role in this. Food-based dietary guidelines. Every country has food-based dietary guidelines. They're targeted to consumers, but governments should align their policies to the food-based dietary guidelines as well. So they're not just for consumers. So public policy can play a big role here. We heard last night how the government of Costa Rica has really managed to find this sweet spot between health, biodiversity, and climate change. Every country could do that. It's just a matter of public pressure to force them to do it.
Should we take a question? I see someone over there.
David Wilcox, Reach Scale. Everybody thinks because they're talking about behavior change that they're talking about scale. We're not. All of the things you want to have happen will happen. They will all take too long. When they're find stuff that doesn't require behavior change to scale, or that can scale with very targeted behavior change. So there's at least a dozen examples in the food sector, and there's an equivalent number in every other sector. They're all ignored. For example, we're misaligned, but we're misaligned at scale, which means there's huge groups that benefit from the misalignment, and they will fight realigning tenaciously unless you can figure out how to bypass them. How have they misaligned the agricultural sector? There's technology available right now to double the protein content of maize. You're free to switch people out of maize, doesn't matter. If you can't take the 5 crops and increase the protein content while you're switching them out, so how do you do that? You go to smallholder farmers because they're the most motivated to do it, and you know what happens when you go to them? You get a proposal for $700,000 to have 1,000 farmers test a new technology. That's misalignment. No new technology will ever surface from the thousands of scientists that are working on this, many of which already exist, if it costs you $700,000 to get 1,000 farmers in Kenya and Zambia and Zimbabwe to test the product. Total misalignment. Another misalignment, every woman in the world who is pregnant wants to have a healthy child. There's virtually never been a successful test of a solution for stunting. Because when you test the women, they're so malnourished that they would have to have 100% compliance to get a healthy baby. So every test fails. So what is the product that's needed? The product needs to lower the cost of protein by 70% in India, in Africa, so that most of the women can buy their own solution to the problem so that they're healthy enough when they get pregnant that buying that product will get them a healthy child at scale. Those 2 scale examples don't require any other behavior change other than providing the right product and getting rid of the inhibitions to the smallholder farmers and getting rid of the inability of all those women to just go buy the product, open it, and eat it. If it's 70% less, thank you. That just scale. You've got to scale things that don't require behavior change.
I just wanted to go back to a point that a few people have raised of research, and I noticed that there was a study in the British Medical Journal recently that said that a vegan diet may increase the likelihood of suffering a stroke. I'm curious, I think that there is research to be done on the nutrition side, on the sustainability side, there's a lot of research left to be done, and I'm curious to hear from the group where you think the gaps are in our current knowledge in terms of what would happen to the environment and to our health if there is a whole-scale adoption of a plant-based diet.
I've been involved with the Dean of the School of Nutrition at Tufts, Dean Mozaffarian, to establish a National Institute of Nutrition as part of the NIH here in the United States. The NIH, has all these institutes: cancer, heart disease, endocrinology, arthritis, you name it. Their commitment to nutrition has dramatically been reduced over the last 20 years at the NIH. They've tended to put most of the nutrition in the endocrinology world, so it's in the diabetes world. And so, we don't know a lot about nutrition. We know a fair amount, but it doesn't get the attention that it should have. And as somebody else before said, the land-grant schools, I'm talking the United States now, but there are parallels to the rest of the world. The big land-grant schools do a pretty good job, but by and large, there's a routine nature to their research in the area of nutrition. They tend to do a lot of the same stuff over and over and over again. Doesn't mean there isn't some good stuff going on. So my judgment is that we need a tremendous jump start in the area of nutrition. knowledge, and both the private sector and the public sector working together on this. But the consumers are very confused about these issues. Average people out of into the heartland of America, and perhaps in the rest of the world, get conflicting messages. And when you watch television and social media, what are people hearing? What do people see about food? They tend to see very calorie-dense, high carbohydrate-related food. So what are kids supposed to do? What are parents supposed to do in this context? So a combination of higher focus on nutrition, coupled with looking at how foods are marketed, I think we'll have a fair amount to try to improve behavior. One final thing, the gentleman just talked about scale. I'm reminded, Walmart just did two things that are just amazing. Okay, one is they said they are going to limit the sale of automatic weapons. They just said it, we're going to do it. They sell 20% of the stuff in America is sold by Walmart. The second thing they said is no more vaping. You know, I mean, as soon as they get all their current vaping sold, they're going to get out of the vaping business. All right. So I'm just saying there are forces in our society that can really have profound changes. And sometimes these are very significant material, revolutionary type changes. And we shouldn't forget about that. And why is Walmart doing this? Because they're listening to their consumers.
I can comment on a little bit on the research, which I think is a whole nother day-long conversation. I think on diets, we still really don't know what people are eating around the world, why they make certain choices, the cost of those diets. We're starting to learn, but a lot of the data is modeled. Global burden of disease, global dietary database, that Mosafarian leaves at Tufts is all mainly modeled estimated data. So just the diets of understanding what people eat. And then the risk factors, there was talk about sugar, but it's actually, the models show that sodium is the #1 risk factor of our diets and contributing to the burden of disease. But we hear a lot about sugar. It's popularized as being, it's the current demonized nutrient, or maybe it's not a nutrient, depends. I think we also have real dearth of information on low and middle income countries. Most of our diet and food system data of looking at its health impacts comes from high-income countries. And that was one of the criticisms of the Eat Lancet Commission. The Eat Lancet Commission, one thing we didn't do as I was part of this, and all of its controversy, I feel like I'm admitting something, anyway. We really, yeah, am I among friends here? We really looked at the production side and then the diets, but nothing in between. So really understanding the plethora of activities and actors that happen in between that, at the farm gate to what's on people's plates, we still don't know a lot about from a climate and environmental perspective. And one thing, to come back to your question, Danielle, on the research side, but also something you mentioned earlier of the livestock industry and what would happen, who would win, who would lose in this more plant-based world. There was a real subtlety in the Eat Lancet, and something we need to understand more, and Tim can probably speak to this. If everyone moved towards that Eat Lancet, very plant-based type diet, our current production systems would need to really change significantly. And we actually, as it stands now and potentially into the future, we couldn't produce that plant-based diet. We don't have the land for some of these fruits, vegetables, legumes, nuts, and seeds. Tim looks like he's disagreeing with me. We don't have some of the yields. And that was mentioned in the Eat Lancet very subtly. But and maybe Tim can correct me on that. And then on the types of diets, the vegan, I think you have to look at the consensus of research and what the burden of disease is of different diets. We know the Mediterranean diet, there's been many, many studies of its benefits to different health outcomes. Vegan stands pretty clearly as being healthier than an omnivorous diet. So I think you have to look at the whole range, not just one-off studies, and look at what the whole body of literature is saying. Tim, do you want to correct me on the...
Well, partially, I think we're getting a little bit, we're counting our plant-based chickens ahead of ahead of whatever, ahead of ourselves, right? As I said, we can have massive dietary change and still end up with an increased consumption of animal products. So I spent precisely 0% of my time worrying about people eating too many plant products as opposed to animal products. We got an unbelievably long way to go there. I mean, nutrition issues are important research, but that's not the biggie. So and actually in this space, it's interesting. In our report, which is kind of like the competitor lens in a way, we do a lot more on production. We focus a lot more on reducing beef. So they put all red meat into one category because they were so focused on health. But from a greenhouse gas standpoint, environmental standpoint, beef is off the charts compared to pork. It's 10 times worse than pork in almost all environmental factors. So we really do focus on that. But the thing was that the one area where we're less worried about research dollars is in plant-based product development because the private market is doing that. Let me give you an example of where we really do need huge research dollars. Things like producing alternative proteins for animals. So, for example, right, we're relying on soybeans. We're relying on all of these very intensive crops. There is every reason to believe that you could be able to provide the same type of nutritious feed using perennial crops, even using manure. Because these products have a lot of protein and a lot of energy in them. They're just not as digestible by animals. So this is an example. There are plenty of places in the agricultural world where we need dramatically more research money. Ironically, for us, exactly because of people like my neighbor here, there is a lot of money going into plant-based development. I think they're going to get there. I mean, I'm a huge believer that we have turned the corner and we are going to have reduced costs and we will have a big effect on global diets when it's generally cheaper. And I think behaviors change much more rapidly than people think when the cost is right.
I just think with diets, I mean, to research, in addition to funding dollars, I also think there's a lot of work that has to be done in defining what it is that you want to research. Because the example about veganism, right? So I trained all these chefs who were largely vegan. Vegan fast casual in developed countries is not really healthy vegan food, right? Or healthy to eat. It is highly processed. It's very fried. It can be very, rich in oils and in excesses. So, but a whole traditional, unrefined vegan diet, I think has super health benefits, right? And I'm not a nutritionist, but I know that there's all of these micro divisions that have to occur to fully understand kind of what you want to research and why, because you can't just make a sweeping statement that veganism is healthy or unhealthy because there's so many, shades of gray when you talk about it.
On the research side, it is remarkable that the thing that's driving our health burdens, the main thing, diets, poor diets, we know very little about poor diets. It's kind of amazing. So I totally second what Jess says on that. On the, does this diet have this health effect? That's important. And for the very points Jonathan made, those are very important points. But I think one of the big research gaps, and certainly in the public sector side, acknowledging that the private sector will take care of a lot of the research, is it's not so much on the why, it's the what to do and how to do it, and on the public policy side. And policymakers, I talk to them a lot, ministers of agriculture, health and planning, they are confused. They don't know what to do. So we have to come up with some kind of no regrets set of policies that may not be the optimal for their particular context, but is going to be a positive shift in the dial that is going to help us do everything. It's going to create an environment that's enabling for everything else we want to do.
Just add to that, medicine and health, the knowledge of nutrition is pretty limited. So very few medical professionals are taught anything about nutrition in medical schools. Now, dietitians and nutritionists are, but the relationship between food, health, medicine, and longevity, this is another area that just cries out for additional research, and having even the healthcare provider having some knowledge of this subject is really important.
I was told that doctors in the US only have to study nutrition for 5 days. out of the whole course. I don't know if that's true or not.
That is true. In fact, at the school that I was running, we graduated about 10 doctors in the past 2 years. And when I asked them why they were taking a vocational school chef training program, the answer was always, because I'm tired of prescribing insulin. Right? So that was, it's very powerful when you see that kind of connection try to come to light.
I understand the importance of sponsorship for these kinds of events, right? But I urge all of the people who are at the table here to go to the organizers of the conference and say, you know what? Highly processed snack foods, high in sodium, high in sugar, are not appropriate for signaling the kinds of change that we want to make in this world.
It's astonishing, Clay, when you go to a nutrition conference, you'll see sponsorships of multinational, transnational companies who are not producing the best food in the world. And when you look at the display of food served, it's just incredible. It's not totally unhealthy. And this is in nutrition science conferences, you see this.
Absolutely. In the events
it's a phenomena, but yeah.
In many of the events that I've been involved
It happens all the time.
Like Upfield, part of Unilever until recently, need to be brought to the table because of the economic impact that they can bring, right? But oftentimes those kinds of messages get lost in what we're looking at the table as we're participating in. When we talk about the culture of food and how it's related to driving change, we can change the culture of food, and everyone here, including myself, need to go to the organizers and saying, that's not acceptable in terms of what it is that we're trying to do within the context of these panels and these discussions. Anyway, so I urge action at all levels by all of us, all right, to express that.
I think we have to wrap it up. I just wanted to say thank you for a really lively discussion. I learned a lot. I think, yes. I think Concordia had hoped that there would be some type of consensus that came out of this panel. I think that, I think there's a lot. I think we covered a lot of ground, and it seems that there's still a lot to learn, and we're perhaps at the beginning of whatever's going to happen with the plant-based trend. So thank you all for your time, and thanks everyone for joining us.